Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate the opportunity to present on your channel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicole Villas, and I currently serve as the board president for the Dravet Syndrome Foundation. Dravet syndrome is a severe epilepsy associated with SCN1A mutations that lends itself well to the computational analyses that you all perform. But my talk today will be less technical than what you're used to and will hopefully give you some perspective and something to think about as you hammer away on your computer models or whatever type of research you're performing. So when Dr. Lau asked us to give the parents' perspective on his channel, I wondered whether you'd rather hear another story of a parent's journey with their sick child, which you've no doubt already heard, or if you wanted to hear the story of how DSF has single-handedly changed the landscape of Dravet research by drawing in experts with modest grants and then encouraging them to apply for larger NIH grants, or maybe what your research means to the families. And I thought about this for a long time, and then it finally hit me one day while I was talking to a researcher about something totally different. We were talking about how to show the parents what some of the scientists working on Dravet syndrome were doing day in and out, kind of thinking about how we could have some sort of lab video or animals at our next conference to show what our researchers are doing. And oh, this person said, well, that's probably not such a good idea. You know, the seizures the animals have are pretty severe and they can be upsetting to watch. And I hadn't necessarily been thinking of showing affected animals, more the healthy ones in the kind of the lab setup, but the researcher was right, of course. The seizures are severe and they are hard to watch, and we probably wouldn't want to show that to other people. And obviously the ethical treatment for animals committees doesn't necessarily want those scenes playing out in the public eye. But at that moment, I was reminded of one of the disconnects between the parents and the researchers, even the most empathetic and dedicated ones, because at that moment, I was imagining my own son's seizure that very morning before school. Blue, convulsing, his oxygen saturation was down below 15%. The whites of his fingernails were ghostly against the blue fingertips. And I was imagining him seizing and then helping him recover, and I sent him off to school just like any other day, but that researcher was thinking of mice. And that's when I knew what I needed to talk about today. Our kids are the experiments. So starting back at the beginning, it wasn't always like this for me. My career started out much the way I imagine many of yours did. My first real experiments were in a lab focused on synthesizing eleutherobin, which is a obscure molecule with the potential to inhibit cancer growth. And I thought I was dedicated. My experiments were long, they were sometimes failures, they were sometimes successes, and they kept me awake at night. And then I went into industry at a small chemical company that manufactured the electro and electroless plating baths used to make patterns on circuit boards. And the experiments still kept me awake at night. They were longer now, painstakingly long sometimes it seemed, and I was more aware of the cost of research. The product the team and I worked on was our baby. We scaled it up from the lab to the pilot line and eventually went into production at customer sites where our baby was then their baby. And failure meant not only my job, but the customer's jobs and millions of dollars in defective product. So I thought the stakes were pretty high, but that's science, right? You pour everything you have into an experiment or into a project. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And then, as so often happens for women, babies halted that career. Not at the first baby, who's 16 now, or even the second, who's 14, but by the time the third one rolled around, he's 12 now, the cost of childcare just didn't make any sense anymore. You always think you'll go back to science when you're in school, or when they're in school, and that this is just temporary, a slight detour. And then, bam, too, at only 11 months old, that last baby had his first seizure. He was just playing with his brothers, giggling like a fool, when all of a sudden I realized no one was laughing anymore, and I looked down at my feet, and there he was, twitching and convulsing, making this awful gurgling sound. I knew it was a seizure right away. I called 911, but I had no idea what to do for a seizure, or that it should have stopped by the time I even picked up the phone. So I scooped him up, and even then I was worried that moving his neck might cause some sort of spinal injury, but I felt the need just to cradle him. The night is a little bit of a blur, but I do remember the ambulance driver yelling back with the sirens blazing, "He's not still seizing, is he?" They drilled into his shin to start an IV, but they still had to intubate him and induce a coma at the hospital 30 minutes away, and the seizure was still going. After an hour, when they lessened the sedation, he was still seizing. But by an hour and 40 minutes, he had stopped. They ran every test in the book, couldn't find anything wrong. And that's when the real experiments began. Except now the stakes were a lot higher. My lab notebook wasn't a journal of ideas anymore, things that had potential intellectual property, failures, or lessons learned. Now it was a desperate attempt to make sense out of data that just didn't make sense. Every entry in that seizure log has a horrible memory with it, with circumstances I made myself record just in case there was some connection that the doctors missed, just in case it was something I was doing or causing. It was personal now. There was no cause for the seizures. No one knew how the meds work. Every medication we tried was an experiment. Only now I was a part of that experiment, and the experiments were long. One neurologist's words have been in my head for the past 11 years. He said, 6 weeks on, 6 weeks off. Anything less than that, and you might be dealing with withdrawal or medication effects, not just epilepsy. So every med you want to try is at least a 3-month experiment, and that's a long time when you're watching your child seize. When you're a young researcher, you think you're pretty objective. You know there's bias. You blind your tests. You analyze the data after the blind is broken. You use design of experiment programs to lay out your experiments. You assign random numbers to each data set. But you kind of think that's more of a precaution than anything. And at first, I thought the same thing was happening with my son, that I was a researcher, an impartial observer. I took notes. I recorded side effects. I watched and I waited. I knew it wasn't perfect, whatever this was. Epilepsy still wasn't a word I was still comfortable using. Whatever this was would change. Whatever syndrome he had would evolve. But I thought I was approaching this from the most scientific way possible. One day, I found myself alone in an ER with a 2-year-old who had eaten a light bulb while it was on, and it was hot. And his mouth was covered with these severe burns, and who knows what else was in his stomach, along with the swallowed glass. I was prepping my summary for the doc. Okay, he has seizures and some developmental delay. He doesn't feel pain. And as I was prepping myself, I thought back over the past year and remembered that I'd also found him gnawing on the dining room chair, kind of like a dog chewing a bone. And I'd found him licking the gel dishwasher soap out of the little container in just the time it took me to shut the door. And he would go outside and eat dirt. He would bang on the glass just to get out to the garden to eat dirt. And he also, at one point, reached up under the child-lock glass fireplace doors and grabbed some of the charred wood to chew, and I found his face all black. And sitting in that ER, I realized this wasn't normal. I shouldn't try to explain it away. These are probably side effects of Keppra, his first anti-seizure med. And that's when I realized I was part of the experiment. My judgment was clouded because he was a person growing up with this encephalopathy affecting his development, and I was attributing things to that encephalopathy without realizing it. I should have been attributing them to the side effects of the medication. One of the worst experiments I remember was when Aiden started his photosensitivity. I would get annoyed that he'd want to be carried for this short 1-block walk to take his brothers to the bus stop. He'd cower in my arms and he'd jerk every now and then. But it wasn't until he started consistently having full-blown tonic-clonic seizures at the bus stop that I realized he was having little myoclonics every time we stepped out the door. And those would culminate into the big tonic-clonics if we stayed out too long. I figured I could fix it. No problem, I thought. This is a chance for me to be a scientist again and put on my thinking hat. I bought every type of sunglasses on the market. Polarized, double polarized, blue, pink, amber lenses. I layered them on top of each other. You name it, I tried it. I tried to figure out whether the direct current in the incandescent lights differed substantially from the indirect current in hospital lights. And every attempt to fix it started with me strapping a pair or two of these sunglasses over his face, opening the door, taking him out to the backyard, and timing how long it took him to seize. The winners never prevented the seizures, they just delayed them. So stop and imagine that for a couple minutes. Imagine that the experiment is you inducing seizures in your own child just by walking out into the backyard and doing it in the hopes that you might be able to find something that allows him to leave his house or go to a store with fluorescent lights. And when you imagine yourself in that position, then you understand what it's like when the experiment is on your child. It's not in a lab. It's not in a dish somewhere. It's not on a computer. It's in your child. The winning ticket is this pair he's wearing in this video. It's a ridiculous pair of swim goggles with blue lenses. The sides I blacked out with a Sharpie marker. And then he has lenses from a polarized pair of blue sunglasses strapped over the top. You can barely see anything when you put these on. And it was how he spent his entire life from age 2 to 4 years old. You wonder, is it the wrong meds? Is it his epilepsy progressing? Is it because of his status seizures, which he was still having at that age? What is causing all of this? Is there something metabolic happening? And these are all questions you're asking as you're doing multiple experiments on your child. So nothing is perfectly controlled when it's a human child, unfortunately. I finally realized that it's probably Dravet syndrome, even though he was still functioning pretty well for a 2 to 3-year-old, 3 to 4-year-old, somewhere in there. Everything I read online said that his progression was likely Dravet syndrome. And somewhere in that time, a neurologist finally listened to us when we said that this isn't normal, this isn't just epilepsy, something's really wrong, and this neurologist ordered a genetic test that came back positive for an SCN1A mutation. That was back in 2008, so let's skip ahead to the present day when we know what that actually means. Dravet is on the severe end of a spectrum of disorders associated with SCN1A mutations. There are some cases of people with just migraines and SCN1A mutations. They're few and far between, but they do exist. And there are some with genetic epilepsy or generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus. But when you add in the prolonged seizures, the developmental delay, and everything else going on, you get a diagnosis of Dravet syndrome. So for those of you who don't know what Dravet syndrome is, it typically presents in the first year with a prolonged status seizure, meaning longer than 5 minutes, but really they're often longer than 30 minutes. That first seizure is usually a hemiclonic involving just one side of the body or a tonic-clonic involving both sides of the body. They happen in otherwise healthy, typically developing infants without brain structural abnormalities or other conditions. Between ages 2 and 5, other seizure types will present. Speech impairment becomes evident. Developmental delay of some degree usually shows up. They can be extremely sensitive to temperatures, so hot baths, going outside in hot weather can cause seizures. They usually develop some sort of ataxia or hypotonia, sometimes a combination of the two that affects their gait, but not in the way that you typically see in older children. They often have sleep issues, meaning you're exhausted, they don't sleep, and they have trouble regulating their autonomic systems. Beyond age 5, the problems from the earlier years usually persist, although the status seizures tend to become reduced in frequency. Their developmental delay can progress to moderate to severe. That ataxia and hypotonia that was evident as toddlers and the preschool age turns into a crouched gait, meaning they're kind of pitched forward a little bit, and you can see lots of behavioral problems. By adulthood, the mortality rate is somewhere between 15 and 20%, most often due to SUDEP, sudden unexpected death and epilepsy, and complications from status seizures, although other accidents such as drowning can contribute to that mortality rate. There's no treatment for Dravet. It may seem like it from this graphic that's on our website, where it lists first, second, and third line medications and then contraindicated medications to use in Dravet syndrome, but really this first, second, and third line are just kind of attempts to control the seizures when you can't actually control them. It's all an experiment. He was diagnosed at age 3, but it's not like that stopped the tests. No med works completely for any child, and you can run those through those first and second line agents before you even get a diagnosis, leaving you with what? Experiments, never-ending experiments. So for one child, he's tried 15 daily meds, 5 emergency meds, all sorts of other treatments, alternative treatments, including medical marijuana. Nothing has completely helped. And my ongoing experiment with my child is 11 years and counting at this point. We're not alone in the constant experiments. Every parent is running similar experiments on their patient, and the caregivers are keeping different lab notebooks than the drug manufacturers. So looking at this Venn diagram in the lower left-hand corner, in a recent survey, we asked parents about the medicines they had used and noticed that the 3 most commonly tried medicines aren't actually the first-line treatments from the last slide. So going back, the first-line treatments were clobazam, valproic acid, and then maybe stiripentol on the ketogenic diet. The most often tried were actually clobazam, Keppra, and valproate. So the first-line treatments aren't necessarily what's commonly used. And then when you take the parent's perspective or perception about which meds are the most tolerable, so looking up at table 3 in the top center, you see that the cannabis and dietary treatments like the ketogenic diet were ranked highest. So parents realize that the seizures will always be there, and they often place the side effects higher in the priority list than doctors or drug manufacturers. So once you have a diagnosis of Dravet syndrome, you're not just concerned about stopping seizures, you're actually concerned more about quality of life. And yes, you want to reduce seizures, but you recognize that that's complete seizure freedom is never going to be a possibility for your child. And these experiments you're running on your child with medications have potential effects on their cognition. So think about that for a minute and how high the stakes are for us. We're not just focused on seizures, we're kind of playing Russian roulette, not just with seizure control, but with their cognitive development, with their brain. So this is taken from a website that hasn't been updated in a while. Funding for a project probably ran out, as usually happens with the SCN1A mutation databases. But at the time this was written, there were more than 1,200 SCN1A mutations in this database. And statistics and what the researchers, geneticists, and computational genetic analysts do, grouping them together, analyzing areas that are conserved across the sodium channels, finding which parts have the high pathogenic mutation load, all of that stuff is phenomenal. But remember that each one of these 1,200 mutations is a distinct person. So every line in this database is someone's child. And every one of those data points is someone whose parent is running experiment after experiment on them, trying to compare to others with the same mutation and finding out that despite perhaps having the same diagnosis or even the same mutation, there are too many other variables involved to really draw any reliable conclusions from the human comparisons. After the genetic data points come the clinical trial data points. So right after you've kind of figured out what mutation you have, then you figure out which drugs might work for this syndrome. They're all SCN1A mutations. And what the drug manufacturers may see as a data point is actually an entire experiment in and of itself. Every clinical trial is really a series of 120 or more N of 1 trials or experiments. I was talking to another researcher who was looking to bring a medicine from their animal models of Dravet to human trials, and they were expressing concern about not wanting to bring something potentially unsafe to our kids, wanting to go through years of safety data to be as sure as possible that it wouldn't hurt our already struggling kids. This was a particularly empathetic researcher who has been one of our greatest assets. But again, that disconnect we first talked about came up, and I said, listen, most of the drugs we are giving our kids aren't approved for their age group. Many of them aren't approved at all. Cannabis, stiripentol. So bring it to the market and bring it fast, because being a guinea pig isn't anything new for us, and we just want to help our kids. We know the risks. So going back, DSF has awarded over, DSF meaning Dravet Syndrome Foundation, has awarded over $3.6 million in research grants for better treatments and a cure. And this is only because of a group of determined parents with the help of several dedicated scientists. And we've exponentially grown the foundation of researchers, labs, NIH funding, and clinicians committed to studying Dravet syndrome. But it doesn't change the fact that every single data point, like I've kind of been hammering into you from now, in every single study is an experiment, a parent's heart, a child's suffering, and several seizures, which, returning to our first point, are difficult to watch in your mice, difficult to analyze with your computer algorithms, but most importantly, difficult for the parents and the family members to watch and for the patient to endure. So that brings us to our last slide. How can we help each other? What we want to know as caregivers is, what does the future look like given his or her mutation? So all the things you guys are doing, analyzing the genetics of it, that's huge. And we want you to keep going, because we really would like some crystal ball that will tell us, if you have this mutation and maybe X, Y, and Z in early childhood, your development will be A, B, and C. That would be fabulous. Take some of our guesswork away. What therapies are most likely to work for given their mutation? And conversely, what's most likely a waste of time? Are there certain medications that work in certain areas of the sodium ion channel, or are all of our mutations, because they cause a loss of function, is the result the same and it doesn't matter which medication you try? It's either going to work or not work in this haploinsufficient model. And lastly, we want you to learn more about Dravet syndrome. We want you to connect with other people researching the same thing you are. We want you to interact with children whose lives depend on your job. And we want you to do this together in a professional environment. So please, little plug for us, come to our conference in sunny Denver, Colorado. It's beautiful here. It's raining and thunderstorming right today, but I promise it's going to be sunny and gorgeous in July. Come, interact with other researchers, interact with the parents, interact with clinicians, because the stakes are high for all of us, and this experiment is never going to end. So, Dr. Lal, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of plug Dravet syndrome with the scientists that you work with. You're doing a wonderful job. I know you guys are at the grind, working hard every day, and we as parents appreciate what you're doing. Thank you.